any sense out of the film.
Listen, well, I will. It's a slippery slope what we're doing, but I yield, Ms. Hageman.
So all of those were videos that I'm actually very surprised that my colleague on the other side isn't fully aware of those particular videos. They've been showed over and over and over again in a variety of media. And I guess that if you have not seen those videos and are not aware of the circumstances where females have been injured by males in volleyball games, field hockey games, and those sorts of things, I guess that I'm surprised that you're saying that this is something that really isn't happening when you're now telling us that you're completely unaware of the incidents where, in fact, it has happened. And what this bill does, the way that this bill resolves that, is that male volleyball player wouldn't have been on that court to hurt the female. That male would not have been in that basketball game to hurt the female. That male would not have been in the field hockey to hurt the female had this bill been in place.
Well, I'm aware that we want to protect young
Please let me finish.
athletes.
I have not yielded to you.
Well, I understand it's her
So
time.
what I'm
Time belongs to
saying
the
is-
gentlelady from
what I'm saying
Indiana
is-
who's yielded to the gentlelady from Wyoming.
What I am saying is that this bill, by stating that it prohibits a person whose sex is male from participating in an amateur athletic competition that is designated for females, women, and girls, those incidents wouldn't have happened.
The time has expired.
Mr. Chairman?
What I'd like to do is adopt the amendment, and then we can keep the debate going. I mean, I think the debate is largely on the legislation, if the committee is comfortable with that. All those in favor of the amendment
Mr.
offered by the
Chairman?
gentlelady from,
I wanted to strike the last word.
you want to go on the amendment?
Yes.
Okay, then the gentlelady from California is recognized to speak on the amendment. That's got unanimous support.
Correct, and I want to yield to my colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Very kind.
That's fine.
I'm not sure of the unanimous support of the amendment, but I do want to clarify that members on this side of the aisle, not speaking for each and every one of them, clearly have as one of their operatives is to protect our children, to protect whether they are athletes or not athletes. The footage that was shown was enormously unclear. There was no language, there was no voice over, there was no print, etc. So let's move on from saying that we have no knowledge or no interest in protecting athletes. My question is, and it is still on the table, House 7187 in any way points to a solution to those acts if those acts occurred. Again, the film does not evidence that, but the point I want to make is that the proponent of the legislation has not answered the question of humanity, has not answered the question of whether or not the cost of discrimination is a higher cost to pay by this legislation than the problem that it's looking to solve. We've already heard from the gentlelady from Washington about what it may do to her daughter, an example of the trans community. I've already offered an amendment that evidences statistically the murders of trans women who happen to be African Americans. Does that legislation, though we're dealing with athletics, deal with the larger question? And there is no answer to that. And so if there is a question of male-female strength, again, she has no answer to that because Mr. Swalwell had a question, what is the mechanism of enforcement? Never has that been answered. What is the mechanism of enforcement? All you have, you're going to have condemnation. In cities, counties, hamlets, states across America, condemnation, interrogation, intimidation. That is what you're going to get. And you have no answer why this legislation should even be on the roster in the Judiciary Committee for us even to move forward. I've said this over and over again. So with that in mind, we have yielded. We will not, I assume you can get your own time. We have yielded for you to answer. None of those answers have been forthcoming. There's no enforcement mechanism at all.
Will you yield?
It is the gentleladies from California's time.
Thank you. It would be up to the USOC in terms of compliance, but determining biological sex can be done with a cheek swab. It doesn't require a physical examination, as has so emotionally been described on the other side today. The other thing that I guess that I'm so terribly confused about is I don't think most people are confused about what is a boy and what is a girl, or what is a man and what is a woman. I don't think that this is some kind of a mystery that we're incapable
The
of figuring out.
gentlelady yield to me.
No, I will not.
It's my time, and I reclaim my time and yield to the gentlelady
You
from
don't want my
Washington.
answers.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, please stop talking about how an emotional response from the other side is not appropriate. We are all human beings in this committee, and it is appropriate for us to have emotional responses about our children and a whole community of children that is listening to this and hurt by it. Secondly, I want to say to the sponsor of this bill, let's just take as given that you actually care about the rights of women and girls in sports. I'm just going to give that to you and say, all right, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Wouldn't you want to listen to what the Women's Sports Foundation says, what the National Women's Law Center says, what the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee says, what the International Olympic Committee says? I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this letter from the Women's Sports Foundation and the National Women's Law Center.
Without objection.
Let me just be clear. Contrary to its title, this bill does not protect girls and women's sports. Instead, it is a misguided and harmful measure that amounts to no more than a discriminatory attempt to target and exclude an already marginalized group of girls and women who are transgender, rather than addressing equity issues that girls and women face in sports. It goes on to say that the policies that ban girls and women who are transgender actually perpetuate harmful and dangerous stereotypes that lead to the policing and harassment of cisgender girls and women. Do you know what cisgender girls and women are? That is what you define as girls and women. And it is saying here, right here in this letter, that it is harmful. What you are doing is harmful to those girls and women that you claim to want to protect. Now, in addition, Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter...
My time has expired, so I need to reclaim it and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Generally yields back.
Anybody who wants to claim time, I would love a little more.
We understand, I'm sure we'll get it, but I would like to deal with the amendment, and then we're going to continue the debate. So the question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman,
We just adopt the amendment, and then we'll come right back into the debate. It's not going to...
well, I want to respond to something that she said on the amendment. So if I can just finish my point, I would really appreciate it.
Well, we'll recognize the ranking member to yield.
I will yield to the gentlelady from Washington.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Additionally, Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter outlines that the practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have access to the practice of sport. And by imposing a categorical ban on women and girls who are transgender, this directly conflicts with the International Olympic Committee's framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. And it goes on to say that actually, under the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act of 1978, the U.S. Olympic Committee is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, age, sex, disability, or national origin regarding. For decades, federal courts that have interpreted these non-discrimination laws have overwhelmingly recognized that anti-trans discrimination relies on sex stereotypes and is a form of sex discrimination. So when the gentlelady who's the sponsor of this bill tries to say that this is actually something that is supportive of women and girls, and all of a sudden the other side has decided they want to be supportive of women and girls, I would ask you to look at what the organizations that actually represent women and girls in sports say. They do not say that this is helpful at all. And my colleague, Mr. Swalwell from California, is absolutely right.
Will you yield?
Not right now, because
you
I
yield?
am in the middle, it's Mr. Nadler's time, but I am in the middle of making a very important point, which is not only is Mr. Swalwell right, and I tried to make these arguments earlier, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people that you are trying to criminalize, essentially, make feel like they don't belong in our country. Not only is that true, it's not a thing, but on top of that, even if we were to take at face value that you care about women and girls, and I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that in my emotional state as a mother of a trans daughter. I'm willing to give you the right to say, all right, I care about this. Even then, why don't you listen to the National Sports Foundation that deals with sports for women and girls and what is good inclusive policy. That is what we should be doing here. And please stop talking about my emotional response to your bill. Yeah, it's emotional because you know what? There are Republican, Independent, and Democratic parents out there of trans kids. I know because I did a roundtable, a bipartisan roundtable with our former colleague, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, about this issue. People don't want this ridiculousness, and it is deeply hurtful and harmful to our kids. Now, maybe you don't have a trans kid. Maybe nobody on this committee has a trans kid. I don't know. I think I'm the only one. But why don't you start to think about what this feels like to kids and parents across the country when you use the kind of language that you do, that is not even based in any kind of science? And so when you argue so righteously that you actually care about women and girls, why don't you start to look at what would actually make a difference for women and girls? Like more money so that we could make sure that women and girls programs are really thriving, like equal pay for athletes so that they can pursue their careers. Those are the things that make a difference.
Reclaiming,
This does not. I yield back to the.
reclaiming my time, I just want to point out, the bill, I agree with everything the gentlelady said, obviously, but the bill, the gentlelady keeps talking about males competing against females. The bill defines a male as, male means an individual who has, had, will have, or would have, but for developmental or genetic anomaly, historical accident, the reproductive system that at some point produces, transports, and fertilizes sperm for fertilization. Would have, does not have, but would have, but for a developmental or genetic anomaly. In other words, the fact is that there are people, a tiny number of people, we call them transgender, who are not males, who may have an X and a Y chromosome, but are not males. They're a different category. They're transgender. And this bill, by seeking to characterize them as males and say that they somehow unfairly compete with females, discriminates against them. And we heard about the tiny number. The governor of Utah said there were four transgender people in sports, and one, on a women's team. Why are we seeking to humiliate and prohibit from participation in sports this tiny number of people who are not, in fact, males? We have to realize that humanity is not, as we thought for a long time, divided into only two sexes. There are more than two. Tiny numbers, but more than two. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, a statement from the sponsor of the legislation will be included in the record. The question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. I assume Ms. Dean wants her second amendment? No, I think we're going to go to Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon is recognized.
Thank you. I do have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report. Gentleman from Florida reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized to explain her amendment.
Okay, thank you. I want to be clear here. This bill, H.R. 7187, is not about supporting and protecting women or females, as the bill would define them. As several of my colleagues have pointed out, the rationale for this bill and many of the comments we've heard from the other side of the aisle elevates cynical and dangerous political attacks on the transgender community. Everyone deserves the opportunity to play sports, to be part of a team, to have fun, and to learn resilience while challenging themselves. House Republicans have already voted to keep trans girls and women off their school sports teams. Now they want to jam through a bill to prevent trans girls and women of all ages and all levels from participating in sports. The fact is that there are real issues facing female athletes, but as usual, our Republican colleagues are missing the mark. Where's the discussion of legitimate barriers like lack of resources, vulnerability to abuse, bias, and wage gaps? I find it outrageous that this majority is yet again using the House Judiciary Committee to fearmonger and bully members of the trans community, a group of already marginalized citizens who just want to fit in and be included. When I was growing up, Title IX was in its infancy, but we knew the purpose of that law was to make everyone welcome and included in sports, an experience that has taught every member of my family valuable lessons that we still use today. Whether in school or elsewhere, we should not retreat from policies that promote the inclusion of all Americans, whether in athletics, employment, academics, housing, or all aspects of our civic life. I understand that the proponents of this bill say that they want to protect women and girls, but as multiple members have pointed out, this bill does so at the cost of marginalizing and harming individuals in our transgender community. That's what this bill is about, exclusion and fear-mongering. Meanwhile, the policies that American people and American women in particular actually want continue to be ignored or attacked. Now, this bill, as written, defines a female as an individual who has had or will have the reproductive system that at some point produces, transports, and utilizes eggs for fertilization. Very handmaiden kind of definition there. This bill mimics bills that have been brought in several states, which have sought to narrowly define the terms male and female while ignoring science and facts regarding sex and gender, particularly for the transgender population. Actual scientific research shows that it's more complicated than just male or female. Sex chromosomes can indicate one thing, anatomy can indicate something else, and other genetic factors can play a role. We know that our Republican colleagues aren't open to considering the rights and facts regarding our transgender citizens, and they've refused to withdraw this bill from the markup. So, since this bill purports to define women by their reproductive systems, I think it only makes sense that we do talk about reproductive health care here today, because we can't talk about women's equality for female athletes or others in the workplace without talking about access to reproductive health care. That's why I'm offering an amendment to this bill to prohibit amateur sports organizations from discriminating against anyone for being pregnant or accessing reproductive health care, including abortion care, contraception, or IVF. And that would include not only athletes, but also the coaches, administrators, and staff of these organizations. Since the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, states across the country have moved to restrict access to reproductive health care in a variety of ways, including banning abortion care, IVF, and certain forms of contraception. The consequences have been devastating, as providers have been forced to relocate and close their doors. And American women have found themselves in dangerous situations as they've struggled to find appropriate care. In the face of that reality, we need to make sure that the athletes and staff working at these organizations aren't discriminated against for accessing needed health care. If my Republican colleagues really wanted to support women, they'd support this amendment and ensure that female athletes and all women have the freedom to make their own personal health care decisions. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The point of order withdrawn. Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, this amendment has nothing to do with the bill that is before this body. Talking about abortion and contraception and reproductive health care services has nothing to do with protecting girls and women's sports and athletics. If you want to come up with and introduce a bill directed to this, you're more than welcome to, but it has nothing to do with the debate we're having today. I also want to say I'm really tired of the other side personally attacking us and impugning our character and accusing us of all kinds of nefarious deeds simply because we do not adopt your radical gender ideology. It was only about 5 minutes ago that everyone in this room would have been able to define a woman and a man. It was only about 5 minutes ago that every woman in this room would have been horrified by the idea that Title IX would be used to allow men to compete against women in athletics. It was only about 5 minutes ago that we recognized that there are biological differences between men and women with very, very limited changes to that, very limited exceptions. This amendment is absolutely unnecessary for the purpose of the bill, which is to protect women and girls in athletics. And in terms of the public sentiment on this, public sentiment is not on your side. The American people do not believe that boys and men should be competing against girls and women. The Washington Post survey from April 2023, 66% of Americans do not think that biological males should be allowed to compete in women's sports competitions at the high school level, and 65% of Americans do not believe that biological males should compete in women's sports at the college or professional level. A Gallup poll released in June 2023 found that 69% of Americans believe that athletes should only be allowed to play on sports teams that match their biological sex, which actually increased since 2021. Nobody is saying that someone who believes that they are transgender cannot compete in athletics. They simply have to compete with the same biological sex of who they are. If someone is transgender and is capable of making it to the Olympics, they are free to compete in the Olympics. But if they are a man, they should compete in the men's category, and if they are women, they should compete in the women's category. This bill doesn't do anything other than that. It just simply states that men should not be competing against women. That's all it does. And as a woman, I take great offense to anybody who believes that I do not sincerely want to protect women and girls in athletics, in the safety of their own homes, in their jobs, in employment, and in every other category. This amendment is unnecessary, and I would urge my colleagues